1980, UFOs besieged a joint British-American Air Force base near Woodbridge, Suffolk, England, known as RAF Bentwaters. Situated on the northern edge of the Rendlesham Forest, the Cold War-era base served as a deterrent to Soviet aggression in Western Europe and played a major role in NATO. It served as the primary home for the 81st Fighter Wing and secretly housed a substantial arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons. Colonel Charles Halt served as the deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters under then Colonel Gordon Williams. On the night of December 28, 1980, Colonel Halt and several service members, including a number of base security personnel, witnessed UFOs maneuvering over the base. One UFO interacted directly with Halt and his men, at one point shining a bright beam of light down to the ground in front of them. Colonel Halt will be appearing as one of our featured speakers at the MUFON Symposium this year, and I am very fortunate to have him with me here tonight. Colonel Charles Halt, welcome to the MUFON podcast.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
I'm really happy to have you here. First of all, I want to say thank you for your service.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I have to tell you, I never intended to stay in the military, but when I got in, I enjoyed it. It was challenging, and for some reason or other, I stayed for a long time.
Well, and that's how I want to start. I want to ask you, why did you join the military to begin with?
Well, it's almost embarrassing. You're probably not old enough to know, but in 1962, the draft was going full blast. Believe me, they were expanding the Army and things were going kind of busy, I guess, for the military. And I took my physical for the draft board and got it classified as A1, which means ready to go. And I graduated from school where I had an exemption, and our next door neighbor was on the draft board locally. And she came over and told my mother, your son better make some arrangements because we'll have him in the next couple of months. So with that in mind, I went down and talked to all the recruiters. I didn't want to go in the Army particularly. I was very interested in the Navy. In fact, I went and took the AFOQT test, which is a qualifying test. And I already had my physical and was ready to be on board of Navy officers for a commission. And I thought about 6 months out of the year, maybe or more at sea. I'm not sure I want to do that. I walked on down the hall and talked to the Air Force recruiter, and he said, I can help you out, son. And you've heard that kind of thing before, I'm sure. So he processed all the paperwork, and he said, now this is going to take a little time. We're going to enlist you, and then we'll try and get you into OTS. He said, if you get a big brown envelope from the draft board, do not open it. Bring it to me, and I'll swear you in. So before I got the envelope, he called me back and said, I've got you a slot. How about coming down? So I enlisted in the Air Force, and the rest is history.
What year was that?
That was 1963, spring of 1963.
Where'd you go after that?
Well, I went to San Antonio, the Lakenheath Air Force Base, for all that torments of, the shaved head and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. In fact, I almost, I'd have gone back home if I could have. The recruiter said, only take your toothbrush. That's all you need. And I wore a nice business suit, and that's all I took with me and a few other odds and ends. And I got there on a Friday and checked in. And the first thing they did was they processed me and shaved my head and told me I couldn't get any uniforms until Monday. So I'd have to wear the same underwear and same clothes. And on Saturday, they took us out in the ball field picking up rocks in my suit in the sun. And I thought, man, this is not for me. I can't believe this. Anyhow, it settled down and things worked out.
Good.
I guess the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm. And you moved up. You moved up in command.
Well, I had an interesting career. I was very fortunate. I was quite often at the right place at the right time, and apparently did the right things. So, in fact, the first thing the Air Force did when I graduated from OTS, they sent me to tech school for almost a year, maintenance engineering, the equivalent of graduate school. It was very good school. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I learned a lot. Spent the next 17 years in aircraft maintenance. In the spring, or well, actually in the winter of 1980, found me in the Pentagon, of all places, managing a good portion of the Air Force's jet engine fleet. I got a call from the personnel people, And they said, you've been selected for special career monitoring. Apparently I'd impressed somebody along the way somewhere. I said, what does that mean? They said, good assignments. So the first thing they did is said, how would you like to go to Iran? I said, what? They said, it's an air attaché to the Shah. I said, sounds interesting, but I'm not sure. They said, here's the Audubon, which is a telephone number for the incumbent there. Call and talk to him. And I called the guy up. And he said, this is one of the best deals you ever get. He said, you can save almost your entire salary. You can't bring a car, but they provide a car and driver. They provide housing. All you have to do is buy food and clothing. And once a month, you get to go to either Germany or to Turkey to shop. He says, it's a fantastic deal. So I agreed. And I was on my way. I was studying Farsi and getting ready to go when suddenly things took a downturn in Iran. And we had some issues where I was working, and they wanted me to extend for another year, and they managed to get me out of the assignment. And the gentleman that replaced me was one of the hostages that spent, one of the 80 hostages were spent in captivity for almost a year or more. Mm-hmm. Well, that settled down, and I finished my extra year. And then they called me again and said, how would you like to go to Oslo, Norway? I said, oh, throw me in the briar patch. They called me back the next day and said, the Sink, who's the commander in Europe's executive officer, wants that position. But we've got a good deal, RAF Bentwaters in East Suffolk, England. It's a big operation. How would you like to go as a deputy base commander? So there I was on my way to England. And I never regret it.
And you wound up near Suffolk at RAF Bentwaters.
RAF Bentwaters, home of the 81st TAC Fighter Wing, the largest tactical fighter wing in the free world. Big operation. 2 bases there, twin base complex, RAF Bentwaters, RAF Woodbridge, separated by the equivalent of National Forest. We called it the Queen Forest, or Rendlesham Forest, as it's known to. It was really a fantastic. To give you an idea of the size and scope, the base population counting civilians and dependents was almost 14,000. It was a small American city. We had everything on the base you could think of. I mean, we had it right there. You didn't have to ever leave the base. But I did all the time. I mean, I would talk rock climbing in Wales and went mountain climbing in Europe and did all sorts of things. But fantastic assignment.
I didn't realize they had that many people there.
It was a huge operation. It was impressive. I mean, it was quite a spread. Kept one busy.
And it was also of tremendous strategic importance to NATO, wasn't it?
Well, the concept of operation was if the Eastern Bloc countries, primarily the former Russian, what do you want to call it, empire, had ever decided to move west into Germany, they'd have to come through the Fulda Gap with all their tanks, equipment, and resupply vehicles. And our mission from the base was to pick up all the A-10s and go with the 6 forward operating locations, which were pre-positioned and stocked in Germany, and go kill tanks and armor. The base would have then been backfilled by strike aircraft, initially F-4s and then F-16s. They would pick up pre-positioned weapons and take the war to wherever necessary.
How long were you stationed at RAF Bentwaters?
4 years. There was a tense time in 1980. Keep in mind, the Chinese were shelling the offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu. The Solidarity was just raising Cain in Poland. The West Germans were having problems with the Red Army faction. They've even had kidnapped an American general, General Dozer. There was just a lot of turmoil. We exercised all the time. You haven't lived till you put on a full chem suit, a flak vest, a steel helmet, and rubber gloves and everything and try and operate. The worst thing is the gas mask would fog up all the time and you couldn't see anything. If you wear glasses now, you put a mask on, you know what I'm talking about. Your glasses fog up all the time.
Absolutely. It doesn't do anything but just stop you from seeing what you're doing, and you become functionless essentially.
But all in all, it was a fantastic assignment. Very good people to work with, a good mission, very interesting place. And I did have a little bit of time to do some things from time to time, although most of my days were 15, 16 or more hours. I spent an awful lot of time out on the base because my job required me to know what was going on. While the base commander was busy cutting ribbons, kissing babies, taking dignitaries on tours, I was in the background making sure everything was working, if you know what I mean.
Yes, this is General Williams, right?
Yeah, General Williams. Well, he was a colonel then. But I spent an awful lot of time, like I say, out in the base. I rode with police patrols most nights for an hour, 2 or 3 or more. I was down in finance. I was at the midnight chow in the dining halls. You name it, I was there. I learned quickly that the colonels were making the big decisions, but the base was being run by the senior NCOs.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to December of 1980, and I believe it was the 28th, and you were at Christmas dinner or holiday. New
Yeah,
Year's.
well, actually, it started before that. It started the night or the morning of the 26th of December. I typically went into the office way early in the morning, usually around 6 or 6:30, to get things organized for the day and just go through everything that happened the previous day and what was on the agenda. And I stopped by the police station to pick up the police blotters. Now, the police blotters are the chronological listing of everything the police had encountered or knew of that was of any significance for the previous 24 hours. And when I walked into the police station, the desk sergeant looked at me and started laughing. Oh, he had a good sense of humor. I knew him, not well, but I knew him. And he said, "Colonel, you're not going to believe this." I said, "What?" And he said, "Last night, Burroughs, Penniston, Cabanatuck were out in the woods chasing UFOs all night." And the lieutenant, who was the on-duty senior police officer, said, "Don't put anything in a police blotter." I said, "What?" I thought it was a joke at first. I said, "Oh, come on." He said, "No, seriously." I said, "What do you know?" He said, "All I know is they thought there was a downed aircraft and they had encountered something funny out in the forest." He said, "I checked everywhere. When they called me and said they thought they had a downed aircraft off the base, I checked with the air traffic controllers. I checked with London Heathrow. I checked with Eastern Radar, who handled civilian traffic. I checked with RAF Woodbridge, who handled the air defense for our sector. And they all said the same thing: nothing flying, nothing active, nothing reported down. In fact, the only thing I could find anywhere was Heathrow said they had a couple of flights over the North Sea coming in from the States, but that was way off, far from us. So I said, "Well, you've got to put something in the blotter." So he put something, actually, in the blotter, something to the effect that they saw some lights, investigated, and didn't say too awful much. Just an entry. I said, "You have to put something in the blotter in case we need to reference it sometime." So I picked up the blotters and I took them up to the office. Every morning, the senior officers all got together, I think it was 7 o'clock, and went over activities for the day and anything of significance. And of course, Colonel Williams had read the blotter and he said, "What's this stuff about UFOs or lights in the forest?" I said, "I don't think it's any significant thing. It's just they saw something and investigated, but they didn't find anything that I know of." And we kind of put it aside. Well, as the day wore on, I realized all the cops were looking at the sky looking for UFOs, and the grapevine was very active in the police squadron, believe me. But there wasn't a whole lot I could do about it, but I was concerned.
What was your view about UFOs generally at that time? Did you even have an opinion? Had you ever even heard of flying saucers or UFOs?
My actual knowledge of UFOs was nil. I can remember one thing in my life, and that was when I was somewhere around, I'm just 12 or 13 years old. Our local church had a rummage sale, and I got tasked with carrying the boxes of stuff into the church hall, to set things up for the ladies. I was sort of like the hired hand. And there was a box of books, and I was an avid reader. And I picked out 3 or 4 good books that looked interesting to me, and one of them was on UFOs. I vaguely remember that. But I read it and put it back down, and I never thought about UFOs after that. I mean, I was too busy doing other things. UFOs were the last thing in my mind.
Well, and of course, at that time, the Air Force just really didn't have time to deal with that. You had more important things to worry about. You had to worry about the Russians. And so
we were busy.
Right.
Like I say, even after the incident with the blotter, I really didn't think about UFOs. I thought, there was some strange thing with light reflection, who knows what. But I had thought there was an explanation. Mm-hmm. I really did. Something happened the following night, which I didn't learn about until, 15 or 20 years later, when people started retiring and talking. Apparently, the on-duty flight lieutenant that was on there on the night of the 26th to the morning of the 27th had an incident and had a nervous breakdown and was there a fact out. She apparently had some kind of an encounter. Some lights were seen in the forest, and she went out to investigate, and something happened to her. I really don't know the details. It's taken me years to chase her down, but she won't talk. So I don't know. However, the following night, which would be the third night, we were having a year-end get-together for the combat support group officers. All 42 officers, except the cop that was on duty and their significant others, got together for a covered dish, sort of end-of-the-year celebration, recognize people, give everybody a little pep talk, and work on the morale a little bit. And we just finished dinner when the on-duty flight lieutenant, Lieutenant Bruce England, came in. Now, he was white as a sheet. Now, Bruce was not a typical second lieutenant. Bruce had been in the Marine Corps for 4 years, got out, got a degree, came in the Air Force and was commissioned. He was a pretty seasoned guy, if you know what I mean. He was not some little kid right off the street. He'd been around. He'd been around a while. Yeah. He wasn't the kind of guy to get excited easy or to try. You couldn't take advantage of him. He was pretty smart.
Yeah.
And he came into the club and said to me, he said, "You and I and the base commander need to talk." I said, "What's going on?" He said, "It's back." I said, "What's back?" He said, "The UFO's back." Well, Conrad was there and we looked at each other in disbelief. I said, what do you mean? He said, "Well, we saw some lights off base. We went off base and the guy saw something." I said, "Oh, come on." He said, "What were you doing off base?" He said, "Well, we thought there was something in the forest that we needed to investigate." So Conrad was going to make a speech and give some presentations and whatnot. So he and I discussed it and it was decided I would go out and put this thing to rest. So I went to the chief of police who was there, Mel Zickler, and I said, "Mel, who's your senior NCO on duty?" He said, "Well, Master Sergeant Bobby Ball." I said, "I knew Sergeant Ball, a very competent individual." I said, "Have him come by the house and pick me up in about 20 or 30 minutes. I'll go home and change clothes." I mean, I was wearing a suit. Then I went to Sue Jones, Captain Sue Jones, who ran disaster preparedness, and said, "Who's your standby person? Who's on call?" And she said, "Sergeant Nevels." I knew Nevels. He was an interesting person, to put it mildly, but he did have a camera and had a great deal of experience with photography, and he had a good Nikon F2 camera. I had one too, so he and I had a little bit in common. I knew about it. I said to her, "Get a hold of him and have him meet me at your office in about 40 minutes. I want him to go out in the forest with us. We're going to go out and put this thing to rest." So I went home and changed clothes, and Bobby Ball came by and Lieutenant England came by in a Jeep. There was one other person, I didn't remember who it was at the time, in the back of the Jeep, and the four of us piled in the Jeep. And then the first thing he said is, "We're almost out of gas." So we had to go to the base gas station. And when we got to the gas station, there were two NF2 light alls. That's some motor generators with the big fluorescent lights on them. They've been out in the forest and were having problems. And the cops that took them into the gas station were fussing with the operator there, saying they're out of gas. And the operator kept telling them they're full of gas. I can't put any more gas in them. There's some other issue. And they were arguing. And I finally told them, "Pack it in, put gas in the Jeep and get out of the way." We crossed the base, crossed the runway, went out the back gate of Bentwaters, went to Woodbridge, out the east gate. And he took me out into the forest. Lo and behold, there's 10 or 15 cops out there, 2 or 3 vehicles towing light alls. And I thought, "Oh my God, what are we doing off base in the middle of the night?" I said, "This is a public relations disaster just waiting to happen." I was really upset. Yeah. Well, I said to the cops there, "I want you guys to be very quiet, stay still." And England said, "The thing that landed 2 nights ago landed right out there." I said, "What?" He said, "I'll show you." It left indentations. So he took me out in the forest. Now, Nevels was with me. Sergeant Pastenza, who joined us as a sort of a horse holder. He was carrying the radio for one of the cops. And myself and Master Sergeant went out to the forest, 5 of us. They took me out in an area about 100 yards in, maybe a little more. They showed me an area. They said, "This is where the thing landed 2 nights ago." I said, "What?" "See these indentations? That's where it stood on the 3 legs." Well, the indentations were about 12, 13 inches across, and they were equidistant apart, and they were pressed well down into the hard-packed sandy clay soil. So while we're there milling around, taking readings with the Geiger counter, which, by the way, were significantly above background radiation levels, but not dangerous. The interesting thing is the 3 indentations got a higher reading, and the center of the triangle formed by the 3 indentations was even higher. So let's check the trees. So he went to the trees around her. These are tall Corsica pines. They had a tall canopy, but there were very few low branches. You could see right through them. And the trees had chop marks and burn marks on them. The chop marks probably were from the Forest Service people marking trees, but the rubber burn marks were different. They were about shoulder height and on the trees around. We took the Geiger counter and held it on the inside toward the indentations and got a higher reading than we did on the backside of the trees. I said, wow, this is really interesting. How do you explain this? And while we're milling around making by the way, I have my little recorder with me, a little linear cassette recorder I carried everywhere.
That's one of the most compelling bits of audio that I've ever listened to in my life. I've listened to that recording over and over again, and we're going to talk about that in a little while, because I think that there were a lot of things going through your mind as you're making this recording.
Well, I don't think I had maybe another tape. I don't think so. But anyhow, it's limited in how much time it has on the tape recorder, the capacity of the reel. So I only turned it on whenever I had something to say. I didn't keep it running the whole time. People say, well, you were out there for 3 or 4 hours. Why didn't you, where's the rest of the tape? I said, because I just turned it off and on. And whenever there was something to say or something happened. Anyhow, while we're milling around and I'm making some notes on the tape recorder, one of the persons in the party, I think it was Bruce England, looked out and said, look out there in the farmer's field. There's something out there, some glowing red object. I said, what? We looked out in the field and definitely we could see a glowing red object about the size of a large basketball or beach ball, but it wasn't completely round. It was more oval than it was round, and it had sort of a dark center, and it appeared to be shedding either sparks or something like molten metal, like slag coming off of it. We watched it for a couple of minutes and it moved about. We watched and got concerned. I thought, I'm seeing ball lightning. I've never seen it before. It actually came into the forest itself, moved horizontally through the trees, bobbing up and down, avoiding the trees. So this thing's under intelligent control. It's avoiding the trees. You would expect it to hit the trees or something. It avoided the trees. Let's try and get close to it. So we tried to move up close to it. And as we got up near it, it went back out into the farmer's field. We stopped at the edge of the forest. There's an old rusty barbed wire fence there. We stood there, watched for a minute or two, and all of a sudden it silently exploded into 5 white objects like fireworks, and it disappeared. It did that silently. There was no noise. The whole time we were watching it while it was in the field, the farmer's house looked like it was on fire. The farmer's house was directly across from it and had rows of windows across the bottom and on the second floor. And you could see the reflection. I thought, wow, I wouldn't want to be in that house that was bright. I swear it was on fire. The whole time we could see the lighthouse off to the right, about 30 degrees off to the right.
And that was a big issue for the skeptics later, the so-called skeptics, right? James McGahey, those guys that said it was, you guys were just watching the Orford Ness lighthouse.
We could see the lighthouse.
Yeah.
In fact, years later, I got involved with Keith Simmons, who was the lighthouse keeper. And he said, let me tell you something about the lighthouse. He said, first of all, it's automated. He said, I have 4 or 5 lighthouses. The days of the old lighthouse keeper being there all night and all day, they're gone. It's automated. He said, but it has 3 lenses, a red, a green, and a white lens, clear lens. He said, you could not see the green and the red from land. It's focused out to sea. It's a navigational light. So he said, if you saw a red light, you didn't see the lighthouse unless you were out at sea. Besides, do you ever see a lighthouse move through the forest? You ever see a lighthouse explode?
I don't think anyone ever has. And I don't think you did.
No. Well, this time I'm really getting nervous and upset. Nobody's ever going to believe this. Why did I ever come out here? I mean, this is phenomenal. I said, it can't be. I wasn't thinking UFOs. I was thinking there's got to be some explanation for this. But I couldn't think of anything. I'm thinking an air inversion, a reflection off something, some kind of a strange light. Oh, gosh, I don't know. So we were out in the field looking around to see what I saw stuff coming off it, sparks or looked like molten metal maybe dripping off it. So we went out in the field and we're looking for any evidence. I said, well, something had to be on the ground. Maybe it burnt the grass or whatever. We couldn't find anything. The only thing we found were cow pies. The cows had been out there earlier, obviously. And while we're out there milling around looking for something on the ground, somebody said, look up in the sky. There's multiple objects to the north. They're elliptical. They look like Cherokee moons, but they have multicolored lights, and they're moving together in synchronization, as though they're flying in a formation or doing a grid search. We watched them for a few minutes, and they turned from elliptical to full circles while we're watching. Now, it could be the way they turned when we first looked at them. I don't know. So, wow, this is something else. I said, let's move further out in the field past the farmhouse so we can get a better look at things. And we moved past the farmhouse, which was silent and dark, thank goodness. We get out in the field on the other side. We look up, and there are two bright white lights, almost blinding, to the south, way out, 2,000 or 3,000 feet in elevation. We're watching them for a few minutes, and one of them suddenly comes overhead at very high speed. I mean, zoom, right overhead, stops. And it was so bright we couldn't see a shape. And it sends down the equivalent of a laser beam right by our feet, about 10 feet away. The beam was about, I don't know, a foot in diameter, maybe a little more, a little less. But it was very focused. And I can actually see the dust particles in it. I remember that distinctly. You know, if you take a flashlight in a dusty environment, sometimes you can see the particles.
Yes.
And just as suddenly as it appeared, like a light switch, clicked it off, it was gone. The object then moved back to the south and moved over Bentwaters base and was sending down beams there. And from the chatter on the police radios, because we had 3 different radio frequencies with us, I had the command net to the command post. One of the cops had the police security net, and one had the law enforcement net. And we could hear the chatter on the security net that the guys in the weapons storage area were seeing beams too, which this is getting scary. The whole time I'm calling the command post repeatedly saying, when we saw the objects to the north, the multicolored objects, I said, have Eastern Radar, who's the closest radar we had in the tower, look, see what they can see. They keep telling me they didn't see anything. Well, years later, I learned they did, but nobody wanted to admit it. What I found out many years later is the air traffic controllers actually saw the object go across their scope twice, somewhere around 2,000 miles an hour. They physically saw the glowing object and watched it go into the forest, but they didn't admit it at that time. They'd learned because some of their contemporaries that reported UFOs in the past had been decertified and lost their career certification. So they didn't say anything. And later learned that the radar people, the British radar people, picked up something briefly too and saw it drop off the scope. So there was something definitely going on.
A couple of the radar operators have come forward since that time, haven't they?
Oh, yes. The 2 operators in the Bentwaters Tower have come forward, as well as some of the British controllers. In fact, some of the British controllers can tell you an interesting story about how long after the event, American and British people in civilian clothes came in and got all their traffic controllers together and told them they didn't see anything, they didn't hear anything. The radars were off, which is BS. They never turned all the radars off. Believe me, you don't turn off the air defense radars.
Not during something like that.
They confiscated the logs. They confiscated all the radar tapes. Now, if the radars were off, why would we want to confiscate the tapes and the logs? Why would you tell people you didn't see anything? So, who knows?
Well, I want to ask you about what was going through your mind as you're watching these objects maneuver over you. What is going through your mind? Are you just simply going with your training and dealing with a new situation you haven't dealt with before and just sticking to the book and not really allowing things to run through your mind, or are there these little voices saying, this is something weird, man?
Well, I have to tell you an interesting story. One of the well-known, at that time anyhow, TV personalities took the tape and had it analyzed for voice stress analysis by the people who did the Watergate tapes. And they said, there's portions of that tape where you just go off the chart almost. And, you know, then you're really strung out. I said, well, I didn't know. Everything's going through my mind, trying to find an explanation. I couldn't find one. And I finally myself came to the conclusion that I wish I hadn't been there. You know, why did I ever get involved? Why didn't I send somebody else out here? When I went out, I thought I was going to go out there for a few minutes, turn around, come back, go back to the party. That's what I thought.
How long were you out there?
We were out there till something like 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, some of the times I put times on the tape a few different places. I came home. Well, actually what happened, we were out there so long, nobody seemed to be caring. I mean, the command post isn't getting excited. None of the other senior officers, especially Williams, are getting there because they could hear my radio transmissions. Williams never turned his radio off, I swear. Nobody seems interested. And I can't explain this thing. I said, enough's enough. When we crossed past the farmer's house, we all stepped into a small stream and got wet up to almost to our waist. Temperatures around 32 degrees. The wind's blowing off the coast. It was, it was a miserable night.
It's December.
I said, we're all tired, wet, cold, and hungry. I said, let's pack it in and go home. So we went back home. I went home, took a shower, had a little bit of something to eat, I think. I couldn't sleep. So I decided to go in the office. Now, our office was a big, long Quonset hut, if you're familiar with them. On one end was the wing commander's office, and the other end was the base commander's office, and we had a common foyer or entryway. And just as I went to open the front door, Colonel Williams drove in, the wing commander. So I waited to hold the door for him. He got out and came up, and he said, Halt, he said, that was some night you had last night, wasn't it? I said, yeah, that's an understatement. I said, I made a tape. He said, what? He said, come on in the office. So we went in the office. I played the tape for him. He said, let me have the tape. So I gave him the recorder and the tape. I said, what are you going to do?
Right. He's your commanding officer.
Yeah, this was Sunday, mind you. So there was nobody else in the office. He said, Wednesday, and I knew this, Wednesday we have a staff meeting at 3rd Air Force. All the senior commanders in the UK get together for a staff meeting with the general. He said, I'm going to take the tape and play it. And I said, uh-oh, there's my career gone. So I worried all week. And I was waiting at the door when he came back around noon on Wednesday. And he got out and came up the steps. And I said, boss, do I still have a job? He laughed and he threw me the tape recorder. He said, yeah. I said, come on in. So I went and sat down in the office. He said, let me tell you what happened. He said, I told the general about it. Apparently the general knew more than what I thought he did at the time. Mm-hmm. And he said, the general listened to the tape and said to Williams, he said, is Halt credible? He said, yes. He says, is the tape legitimate? Yes. He said, staff, what do we do? Well, nobody spoke. So the general, in his infinite wisdom, said, well, it happened off the base. It's a British affair. Case closed. So I said to Williams, well, do we do anything else? He said, no. He said, when Squadron in the Morning gets back, he was in Wales for the Christmas holiday. That was his ancestral home. When he gets back, get with him and drop it in his lap. So I had to wait almost 2 weeks for him to come back. When he came back, I was over there right away. And I told him what happened, and he almost went into shock. He said, he made a whole bunch of phone calls, and I don't know what all he did privately. Mm-hmm. And he came back at me a little later in the morning and said, give me something to talk from, a talking paper. So I wrote that infamous memo. It was never supposed to go anywhere. It wasn't even supposed to go to the MOD. It was supposed to be for him. So he had something he could say, here's what happened. Well, you and I both know what happened. Yes. There's a long story with how it got out, but it got out. And unfortunately, the day it hit the press, I met BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, German TV, Japanese TV, Radio Orwell, and 1,000 other people I'd never heard of before. I had to go into hiding almost. So, wow, it was quite an ordeal. It was quite an ordeal.
Not just what happened that night, but a lot of the things that happened afterwards. Not just to you, but some of the other folks.
Well, see, I brought everybody in not long after that, but unbeknownst to me, before I brought them in, they had been, how shall I say, debriefed with drugs and hypnosis, 4 or 5 or more of them.
That was the subject I wanted to touch on with you, because this is AFOSI that came in, right?
Well, I'm not really sure it was OSI. It was the OSI office where it was done, but I'm sure it was this certain other 3-letter agency that starts with a C. Interesting story. I just found out here this year that the CIA, how you want to call it, liaison to the White House, a very well-placed guy who's into everything, you name it, from remote viewing to whatever, had my memo on his desk the day after. Now, the memo was typed in the office by my secretary on a select typewriter, the old-fashioned things with a little element.
Yes.
It was the only thing we had was a carbon paper, or the manifold as we called it. We didn't even have it. The original, Ted Conrad, the base commander, took it down to Williams after I wrote it and had it typed. Came back and said, okay, I didn't keep enough office copy. I didn't want anything to do with it. I gave the original to Don Moreland. That was it. So if it got to the CIA the next day, Williams had to do it, or somebody in his office. I talked to his exec years later about it. His exec didn't know anything about it. He's a good friend of mine. So it was done directly, probably to the OSI, and from the OSI to the CIA to, boom, the Langley.
So let's get back to what you were saying about the individuals who you believe were perhaps subject, when they were debriefed, were perhaps subject to being injected with drugs.
Probably sodium amyral, maybe sodium pentothal. I don't know. I wasn't there. They're not. Several of them aren't even really sure what happened. The only one that clearly remembers what happened is Penniston. Claims he definitely remembers them asking before they gave him the injection. But they didn't tell me this until we were all long gone from Bentwaters. Mm-hmm. I called them in. It's 3 or 4 days later, because what happened after the first night, the flight that was on was Sea Flight. They went on break for 3 days. So it happened Friday night with them. They didn't come back until Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on what shift they went on. So they weren't available, if you know what I mean. They were gone. They've gone. The Burroughs and Penniston lived in Ipswich, which was 10 or 15 miles away. And I didn't bring them back on the base. I brought them back well after that. But in the meantime, unbeknownst to me, like I say, they've been taken to the OSI office and worked on, so to speak. I asked them to give me statements. They did. I'm not sure how much you can believe those statements, because they were made after or by the agencies that debriefed them. For instance, Cabanas couldn't type, but his statement, he brought it to me, was already typed. And then he later admitted that it was given to him. Here's what you're supposed to say. Hint that it was a lighthouse. So the statements aren't worth a whole awful lot, except perhaps the drawings maybe. Mm-hmm. But
well, wouldn't you say that it appeared that the purpose of that was to, I call it peeing in the pool, to muddy the waters, to obscure, so that maybe produce even perhaps some false memories that could be easily disproven, simply in order to muddy the waters and make things less believable?
Well, it really gets convoluted, because you're right. There's some very, very skillful people that use disinformation to cloudy things up. What better way? If you can't deny an event, what you do is you make it so ridiculous and so far out that, everybody's going to laugh and say, ha, ha, ha. They also had a wannabe by the name of Larry Warren, who ended up writing a book with Peter Robbins, which now Peter's admitted is a bunch of BS. Actually did some good research, but most of the stuff that Warren says is BS. It's been well proven now. We know that. We know. I've
spoken with Peter about that, and we had a discussion about that on the podcast on an earlier episode.
Okay, and then Peter's given me a very heartfelt apology for everything, because for years I've been telling Peter, it's not true. You're being had. I said, get off. You're on a dying horse. Don't ride it to death. Get off while you can. That was when he was working on the book and hadn't even published it, but he wouldn't listen.
Do you think maybe Mr. Warren may have been manipulated in that way?
Oh my, yes, but he didn't need too much manipulation. He'd been involved in so many things, everything from Operation Bullpen. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
The largest sports memorabilia, what do you want to call it? Thing of counterfeit stuff.
Oh,
it was a huge thing, a multi-million-dollar operation. Had many. There's even a book written on it called Operation Bullpen. He was involved in that. He was an understudy to one of the principals. He left the country. And went back to England just as that was breaking, I think, and they let him go because he was a little fish. They probably didn't bother going after him. They got the big guys. Yeah. The guy, he was an understudy, was known as Stan the Man. I have more information on that, but we don't have time to go into all that.
Yeah, that's okay. I understand. Well, I was kind of wondering if that was the case, that maybe he just kind of ran with the ball.
He didn't need much help, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
In fact, he got involved in everything. He was selling John Lennon's glasses, his hat, and his coat. He sold Stevie Vaughan's guitar for 100,000 pounds. It turned out to be a Vocus. He has fake Ben Hopkins paintings he was going to sell, but he got cold feet on that because everybody found out about them.
Holy moly.
Oh yeah, I've got a catalog of stuff. I got a whole file drawer on him. He's quite a character. He would make a good movie character. His life. He's been a professional fraud. I mean, everything from he's been involved in everything from getting fired by Tesco, which is equivalent of Walmart in England, for stealing cigarettes to threatening people's lives. He actually complained he was a member of Hell's Angels. Well, you don't do that. If you put their patch on and you're not a member, buddy, you're in trouble.
You've just marked yourself.
I understand they played a call on him and explained the facts of life to him.
Right. Well, let's talk just a little bit more about not just the incident, but about some things that you've done afterwards. You've written a couple of books, right?
One.
I looked at the Halt perspective, and then I saw one called Bentwaters Revisited.
No, I didn't write that. That was a program I did. No,
well, you might want to talk to the guy that wrote that, because it sure looked like you wrote it.
What's his name?
Well, it said Colonel Charles Halt.
No, I work with John Hansen. In fact, John and I are updating. We've got a lot more material now. There's no doubt about a whole lot of things that have come out after the fact. There are so many wannabes, they just keep popping up. You can't believe how many people claimed they were there. Yeah. Unbelievable. People that were legitimately at Bentwaters at that time put themselves in the middle of it now. And some British people put themselves in the middle of it, even a British policeman. An SAS officer supposedly said, "No, it was an exercise we were running against the base." There ain't no way. There's 2 new books out now that's claimed that it was a mind-altering experience. That's bogus. I can show you irrefutable proof that that's a bunch of nonsense.
Well, clearly the physical evidence that came out of that case, including the elevated radiation in the surrounding environment, the impressions left on the ground by the object that Jim Penniston took himself the next day just to prove to himself that it actually happened to him. There's a lot of physical evidence that came out of that case, and it just cannot be explained by the bogus explanations that have been tossed at it. It's like these are like BBs at freight trains, if you ask me. I mean, the facts are what they are, and you can't get around them. No. You can't explain them by anything other than that base was visited by something, whether it was from another planet, extraterrestrial. I mean, I don't know. Do you have an opinion about that?
Well, I do. I definitely know there's something that we don't or aren't familiar with. I say we, the layman. There may be some people that do know some answers. I'm firmly convinced it's either one of 2 things. Either there's a select group of people who are divorced from the government, ex-government employees, high-level military, scientific, that are in the background, or there's something else more sinister behind the whole thing. The CIA, the FBI, the OSI, all those agencies, they're only tools. They collect, they do things at somebody's bidding. There's something behind it. That's the reason you won't find disclosure very soon.
And so, based on your experiences in that context, looking at what is happening now, based upon what we've been told, or at least the limited number of things that the government has admitted relative to the UAP UFO phenomenon, do you think disclosure is going to happen?
I have my doubts, to be honest with you. People say the government's doing this and the government's doing that. They assume that the government is an entity that works together, that works in lockstep, if you know what I mean, all the agencies. That's BS. Believe me, having been on the inside, I can tell you, all those agencies, the triple digit people, FBI, CIA, and on, and DIA, NSA, they compete for budget. They compete for attention. They compete for, you name it. And they share when they want to. They don't share when they don't want to. So in other words, all these different entities have a little piece of the pie, so to speak. There's no one entity except away from the government somewhere. And I don't think you'll ever find it unless they want to be found. And I don't think they want to be found. Mm-hmm. It goes back something like the Majestic 12 thing. I'm not saying Majestic 12 is real, but something of that nature.
Yeah, we don't necessarily want to say that we know for sure that Majestic 12 was real, but I think it certainly goes without saying that there had to be some kind of, it has to be some kind of, it's still an organization that has the ability to operate in the manner in which you're speaking. They have to be able to operate in secret, and they have to be able to sort of operate above the fray, so to speak, and are probably the ones pulling the strings. I suspect, and maybe you have an opinion about this, but I suspect that there are, of course, private interests involved.
Oh my, yes. Oh my, yes. I would look to companies like Lockheed. I would look to companies like
EG&G.
Yeah, there's a Bigelow. There's a whole lot of people that may have a piece of the pie, but something else is behind the whole thing. There's something, and we assume it's something, a humanoid or whatever. It could be something we don't even understand. It could be more spiritual. Who knows? Mm-hmm. We do know that these things can change size, change shape, change color, do phenomenal things, appear on radar, disappear on radar. They may even tie into things like people claim they see strange animals, a big wolf-like dog, Bigfoot. They may even tie into some of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Let's face it, we've never found a dead Bigfoot, have we?
No. Not that I'm aware of. So all these phenomena clearly do tie together in some way. Some speculate that it's, consciousness that underlies all of this stuff. And I've been hearing a lot of that lately, this sort of idea of the theory, not necessarily of the theory of everything, basically, relative to paranormal stuff. And yeah, you are, with the Bigfoot stuff, and while you've got the Skinwalker Ranch, a lot of documented things down there, and the the NIDS stuff, and the stuff that Edgar Mitchell was involved in. You begin to see that there's a broader universe out there that we're just beginning to scratch the surface of. It's what is disheartening about it is that the government, if you want to call it that, and the powers that be certainly know a lot more than they're telling us. And I suspect, and I've had this discussion with some of my other guests, that it's likely with relative to the UAP UFO subject that the visitors themselves are the architects of the secrecy.
Could be. You've been talking to Jacques Voulet, I can tell.
Well, I haven't talked to him, but I certainly I hang around people he hangs around with.
He and I had to go around.
You and Jacques Voulet.
Yeah, because he put some stuff in his book Revelations about Bentwaters, and he didn't do his homework. And I wrote him a scathing letter, and he came to Washington, and he and I sat down and went through it, and he apologized to me.
Oh, that's wonderful. I've always considered him to be an excellent investigator, but I think he's also gotten into a certain way of thinking. Like a lot of people do in this field, you get into a certain way of thinking, and it's hard to allow new information to come in that contradicts what you already believe. Right?
Well, the current books that are out now talk about, microwaves or ultra high frequency things doing mind control things. But keep in mind, now you have 50 different people or more at probably 10 or 15 different locations. You have the air traffic controllers at Bentwaters, the air traffic controllers at Eastern Radar, RAF Woodbridge, all the people in the weapons storage area, the 15 guys left behind us when we went into the forest, the British people that have come forward and seen similar things. You tie all that together, and it's almost impossible for someone to have influenced them and done mind control.
Absolutely. Now, it had to be a big plan. It would have to involve a conspiracy with hundreds of people look
at it this way. Rendlesham Forest is a very popular place. Dog walkers, joggers, bicyclists, all year round, even at Christmas time, there's people in and out of the forest all the time. If someone were to go out there and try and set up something where they could generate whatever energy, they're going to have a power source. Now, this is 1980, before lithium batteries, which means an awful long extension cord or a generator. There's no way for 3 days and 3 nights you can keep that kind of stuff secret with all the people that are out and about. Now, are you going to do mind control on people that are guarding some of our top secrets in a weapons storage area, armed with automatic weapons with a license to kill? The people in the weapons storage area have it. They have the license. deadly force authorized. You're going to screw with air traffic controllers? None of that. You're not going to do that stuff. It's not going to happen.
Ergo, the incident occurred just as you and the other witnesses said it did.
It did.
Yeah. And now I'm sorry, go ahead, continue.
And there's even a guy that's come forward now and says, I was out poaching in the woods and I saw it and I have pictures. Well, I looked at his pictures. That's not Rendlesham Forest. Another wannabe. I mean, there's just no end to the wannabes that come forward.
Now, you're gonna be talking this summer at the MUFON Symposium, and can you tell us about what you're going to talk about? Now, you don't necessarily need to do your whole talk, but what are you going to talk? What are you going to talk about this summer? Because I think we're looking forward this summer to some big things happening, maybe some more information coming out, and so I'm kind of wondering what you're going to tell us.
Well, there'll be a lot of people there that don't know the whole story, and when you put it out. So I'm going to have to walk through for the first portion of my talk, basically what happened. I have to abbreviate it a little bit probably, and there'll be a lot of questions come out of that, I know. But I want to talk about all the nonsense that's come out, believe me, and explain, why this is not right. Mm-hmm. There's two stories I've said all along: the story what happened and the story what happened afterwards. And the influence in this, what to call screen memories that a lot of people have. The two primary participants from the first night, have undergone regression hypnosis multiple times. Guess what? Trying to find out what happened. Mm-hmm. And they don't really know for sure. I'm firmly convinced. And that's no disrespect to them. They were screwed up. They've never been the same. I knew Jim Penniston very well. I spent an untold number of hours cooped up in the command post on our exercises, and he was always the cop liaison. So in other words, he was right there in the room with me for hours and hours and hours and hours, more times than I can count. And he was very, very good at what he did. He's not the same.
Mm-hmm. Well, it messed with those guys, not just emotionally, but also physically. They've had some physical difficulties, anomalies that have arisen, cardiac issues and so forth, right?
Well, yeah, maybe, I don't know. I can't say it, I'm not a doctor, and even the doctor can't say for sure, I don't think. Some of the doctors, including a very well-placed one with the CIA, think it's related to the incident, and it could be. But I did write a very, very lengthy letter to the Veterans Administration on behalf of Jim and John, trying to help them get, and they did a lot of work. They hired an attorney and went after the VA and everybody imaginable. They got several well-placed people involved. And Gordon Williams wrote a letter to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force asking for help for them. And I think what the VA did, not to admit that there was something happened, but to get them off their back and to just get this thing go away. He got too much on them.
Mm-hmm. Colonel Halt, if there was one thing that you want people to know that you have learned and that you want to share with humanity generally, that comes to you as a result of your experience or your experiences relative to this subject, is there one thing that you would want people to know, that the information that is most important?
Well, the most important thing is something significant happened, but the problem is I can't explain it. And that's very, very frustrating. But if you ever have an opportunity to get involved, and I warn you, it's like a tar baby. Once you touch it, you got it. You can't get away from it. And it's been a real problem for most of the people that were involved, because they can't divorce this from their normal life. I've learned to just put it on the shelf. Unless somebody such as yourself contacts me, I don't worry about it. I can't do anything. I can't change it. It's there. It happened. Yeah. It's not going to go away. Yeah. So,
and once you come to grips with this topic and what it means to all of us, you start to see the world in a completely different way, and you could never go back to the way you looked at it before.
There's no doubt in my mind we aren't alone. Now, what it is, I can't tell you. I know there's something there. I can tell you that for a fact. There's no doubt about it. I've talked to enough people, sincere people that have had experiences, I'm sure you have too, that there's something there, there's something to it. Now, probably 70, 80, 90% of what's reported as UFOs, UAPs, or whatever can be explained. But there's significant amount of stuff that cannot be explained by any rational person.
Yeah. Colonel Halt, thank you very much for joining me today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Well, you're quite welcome. It's my pleasure.
I look forward to seeing you at the symposium.